Arguing was always followed by silence when I was growing up. Hours, days, weeks, months when I then became an adult. In fact, the reason I'm no contact now is because I simply asked her not to do something very, very small. And how dare I? My raising something that upset me, or indeed the other way round, was either met with attack or led with it. Conflict wasn't about resolution, it was about destruction of me specifically. It was an opportunity for my mother to reassert her dominance, her control, her priority in my life from the moment I was born until I went no contact. I learned that resolution was based on me saying sorry, not on trying to understand what had happened and why, and that nothing but pain came from it. I learned that conflict was loud and angry and belittling and shaming and critical and, quite honestly, an excuse to spew hatred at me on a foundation of something so minor that it often got lost within seconds of the opening gambit. I mean, why wouldn't I be considered inherently evil, given I'd forgotten to put the new loo on the holder? And I wasn't supposed to argue back, God forbid, or have a voice or an opinion. And once it was over, I was supposed to pretend it had never happened and never raise how she spoke to me or how hurtful it was. But that loo roll could get brought up whenever she needed evidence for some other imperceptible transgression that needed additional weight, because it was so bloody minor. But I've often said toxic parents have the lumpiest rugs in the world, so adept are they at sweeping things under them, because every argument just ends. No resolution, no accountability, no change, and the only apology comes from the victims. In my case, from me. Or if there was something resembling an apology, it was sorry you feel that way, or sorry I touched a nerve. Apologising for my feelings, my flaw, rather than their behaviour, their flaw. So naturally, I avoided conflict at all costs, kept quiet about things that bothered me, terrified that if I did anything other than agree or apologise, I would be presented with a filing cabinet of evidence of how awful I am. I mean, of course I avoided it. In my experience, conflict was always either terminal for a relationship or an opportunity to tell me what an awful human I was. I read all conflict as attack as a result, primed and prepped to defend myself rather than to absorb and listen. I saw the potential for rejection bulging through the comment, blurring my vision to everything other than avoid rejection at all costs, because rejection was evidence of all the things toxic shame told me I was, the worst of humanity. Rather than, we're in a relationship and for it to keep working and growing, this thing needs to change. Are you happy to change it? And if I wasn't, does the relationship end? And so on and so forth. But then I learned differently. I learned that in healthy relationships, conflict is one and done. It's not raised over and over again to back up another argument. It's not a character assassination. It's about growth, both for the relationship and for each individual as a person. That if someone raises something that bothers them, it's actually them caring about the relationship, and that this thing that's a tiny bit of grit right now has the potential to become a boulder we stumble over. So we need to work together to find a way to stop that happening, and a way that we're both happy with. And I also learned that distinction will help filter the toxic people in your life. I remember a few years ago, someone repeatedly accusing me of something I just wouldn't ever do. And if they really knew me, they would have known that, believed that. But instead, they weren't prepared to let that possibility exist. They kept applying this motive to every situation they could shoehorn it into, and it felt like I was going mad because I just couldn't see what they were saying. I didn't agree with their perception, but still the accusations came. I was checking with everyone I trusted to be honest with me, including my therapist and my supervisor, because of course I believe there must be some truth in it because, well, thanks, Mum. I call it default blame, that thing where you don't even weigh it up. You just start from the assumption that they're right and work backwards because you were always in the wrong growing up. So why would any of this be different? Until one friend said to me, Helen, sometimes people are just determined to believe things about you that have nothing to do with you. And it stopped me in my tracks. I knew this thing. I knew that idea, that concept, but did not apply it there. Because what I realized then was in that relationship, even though I had been assured it was absolutely different in that relationship, it didn't matter what I said, how I explained, how I examined and listened and reflected. They wanted to believe I was doing the thing, and there was nothing I could do that would change that. And that was another important thing I learned about conflict. If someone isn't willing to work towards resolution, if they're not willing to move their opinion of you, and they're only able to see the worst of you, the conflict isn't for growth, it's to silence and control you. Because after all, if they really think you could be doing those awful things they're suggesting, why on earth would they want you in their life? So, it's no wonder you avoid conflict, not because you're unable to accept the truth about yourself. It might be difficult, might have a whole perfection wound and fear of rejection if you're not perfection, but that's a different thing. But not because of that, but because you've only ever experienced conflict as destruction rather than growth. And it's probably close to impossible to imagine someone bringing conflict to you because they love you rather than because they hate you. Today, we're doing conflict, what it actually is, why the version you were given isn't conflict at all, what happens when brains like ours try to disagree with each other, and what it looks like to get better at something that has only ever gone badly for you. I know you've been asking yourself, am I the problem? Let's find out with me, your host, Helen Villas. Here's what I think happens for a lot of you, and if it doesn't fit, of course, that's fine. But before you discard it, allow it to roll around and ruminate a little bit, marinate, and be sure that you're not defending something. Because when we're defending, we're maybe not listening and reflecting. And then take what's useful and leave the rest. Knowing it isn't something you relate to is just as important as knowing something is something you relate to. You don't do conflict. You do capitulation or you do catastrophe, and there isn't really very much in between. So either you're agreeing before the other person has even finished their sentence, apologising for something you're not even sure you did, absorbing it, moving on, telling yourself it wasn't a big deal, or you go from mildly irritated to absolutely certain that this is it. This is the end of the relationship in the space of about 90 seconds. And then there's what happens afterwards. The disagreement is over. They've moved on. They're making a cup of tea and asking if you want one. And you're still 3 days deep in it, rereading their texts for tone, running the conversation again to check whether you said it wrong, waiting for the other shoe to drop. That gap between how long it takes them and how long it takes you is enormous. And I think a lot of you have quietly decided that gap is more evidence that you're the problem. And if that's not you, fine, but just check it again before you decide. Then there's the thing underneath all of it, which is that you probably can't reliably tell the difference between a disagreement and an attack, because in the house you grew up in, there just wasn't one. Someone says, can we talk about something? And your entire system goes just red, DEFCON 3, because in your experience, can we talk about something was never followed by a conversation. It was followed by an hour of being told what's wrong with you. And those things were probably lies anyway. There's also the version of this that happens entirely inside your own head, which is where you have the conflict with them, without them. Weeks of it, the entire argument in which you say it perfectly, and they finally understand, and then you say nothing to them, and the actual thing never gets raised at all. I have to say, the arguments that I've won in my kitchen at 11 o'clock at night against people who weren't even there Some of my finest work, I must admit. I'm going to pull you up on something here gently. You've probably described yourself as conflict avoidant, maybe even as someone who hates confrontation, like it's a personality trait, like it's just how you're built. It isn't. It's learned, and I'm going to show you exactly how. Start with what conflict actually is, because I don't think any of us ever really get shown. Conflict is two people who disagree about something, both of whom have standing to say so, working out what to do about it. It's absolutely not about winning. It's not a competition. There aren't trophies being given out to the person who gets proven right. It's about the relationship. That's the thing that comes out of conflict, better or worse. That's it. That's the entire thing. Now, compare that to what you got, which was a dominance event with a winner and a loser, and the loser was always you. Because in a toxic house, conflict isn't about the disagreement. It's how the hierarchy gets reasserted. And that's why the loo roll just doesn't matter. Why the actual subject of the argument goes missing within seconds of the opening gambit, because the subject was never the point. The subject was just the way in. I obviously don't know for sure what any individual parent intends by that, and I certainly can't say whether it's conscious or what level it's conscious on. But there's that pattern where a small thing reliably becomes a referendum on your entire character, and where it happens again and again over years. What that behaviour communicates is that the small thing was an opportunity, not a grievance. So what gets installed isn't I'm bad at conflict. What gets installed is conflict is a threat to my continued existence in this relationship. And I want to be very clear that this was an accurate reading of your environment. It wasn't a distortion. You learned the correct lesson about the house you were in. The problem is you're now applying it in houses that aren't that one. And the reason it's so sticky is straightforward learning, which is that conceding ended the threat. Every single time you apologised and it stopped, that behaviour got stronger. Every time you kept quiet and the storm passed over you, rather than landing on you, that got stronger too. This is basic operant conditioning, and it's not a character flaw. It's your brain doing exactly what brains do, which is repeat what works. Which is also why understanding all of this hasn't fixed it. And I know some of you are going to be furious about that. Me too. I get it. You've read the books, you've done the therapy, you can explain your own conditioning better than most professionals, and you still say sorry to someone who's just accused you of something that you didn't do. Insight doesn't undo conditioning. Only new experience does. And new experience is precisely the thing you spent your whole life avoiding because it terrifies you. Of course it does. That's the trap. And we'll get to how you get out of it in a bit. You also learned that conflict has a shelf life of forever because nothing was ever finished. The loo roll was still available as evidence 2 years later. So you have no experience of a thing being genuinely over. Which means when somebody in your adult life says, no, honestly, it's fine, it's done, you just don't believe them. You can't. You've got no data for it. And so you keep checking. You bring it up again to make sure. You apologise a second time and a third. And what you're actually doing is looking for the reassurance that it's finished. And reassurance seeking has this horrible quality where it works for about 4 minutes and then you need it again. And the person giving it starts to get slightly irritated, which then confirms the fear that started the whole thing off. Now, where our brains come into this, and both directions, matter here. For those of us with ADHD, emotional dysregulation is a well-evidenced core feature. It isn't in the diagnostic criteria in either DSM-5 or ICD-11, which is a real genuine gap and one worth being really honest about rather than glossing over. I've spoken about it before. But the evidence base for it as a feature of ADHD is solid and it is being looked at being included. Russell Barkley's work on inhibition is where a lot of this sits. What it means in practice is that the emotional response arrives at full volume before you've had a chance to assess whether or not it's warranted. So somebody says something mildly critical about how you loaded the dishwasher, and before any thinking has happened, you are already flooded. Then you're managing the flood rather than the conversation, and the conversation is still going on without you. And I'd add that the flooding itself becomes a thing you're ashamed of. So now you're in a disagreement about the dishwasher managing a physical response that you just can't control and simultaneously running commentary about how ridiculous you're being, which is 3 jobs when the conversation only needed 1. Then there's impulse control, which is the other half of it. And here I mean the gap between feeling something and doing it, or rather than the absence of one. The thing you say in the heat of the moment that you spend the next fortnight paying for, which then feeds the shame, which makes the next conflict more dangerous, which makes you avoid it harder. And absolutely no judgment, because I used to do the same thing. I've said things in the heat of a moment that I would give quite a lot to have back, and the fortnight afterwards, not a lot of fun. For those of you who are autistic, it's different and it stacks on top. Processing time is real. If you need longer to work out what you actually think and the conversation is happening at speed, you'll agree to things you don't agree with, simply because agreement is the only response available at the speed required. Then, an hour later or the next morning, your actual position arrives, and by then, the conversation is closed and reopening it feels like starting a fight. So you don't reopen it. And then you're living with an agreement you never made, resenting it quietly. And the other person has no idea, because as far as they're concerned, it was settled amicably. There's also straightforward communication mismatch. Directness read as aggression when it was just information. A comment taken literally when it was hyperbole. Tone that doesn't match the content in either direction. None of that is a deficit. It's a mismatch, and mismatches are two-way. But you've been trained to assume the fault is always at your end, which is where default blame does its work. Default blame is the thing that I described in the opening, where somebody says you've done something and you don't weigh it up at all. You skip straight to looking for how they're right. You go and check with other people, you examine yourself, you go back through the evidence, looking for your crime. And that feels like humility. It feels like being a reflective person who's open to feedback. It's honestly one of the most convincing disguises this stuff wears, because it looks like a strength, a virtue even. But being open to feedback means considering it, weighing it, deciding. Default blame skips all of that and goes straight to conviction. And a person who convicts themselves before hearing the evidence isn't being humble, they're being obedient. Now, I know some of you will be bristling at that word. Me too. I'm not calling you obedient as an insult. You were trained into it deliberately over years by people who benefited from you being that way. That's not a character judgment. It's a description of what happened to you. Now, here's where this gets genuinely useful, because default blame is also the thing that stops you telling the difference between the two kinds of conflict. Conflict for growth looks like this. Somebody raises a specific thing. They stay on that thing. They want to know your side, and their position can actually move. There's a resolution, and afterwards it's finished. It doesn't come back as ammunition 6 months later. Conflict for control looks like this. The specific thing expands into your character. Your explanation doesn't change anything. Their position was fixed before the conversation started. There's no resolution available because resolution was never the goal, and it gets brought back whenever it's needed. The tell is whether their view of you can move. That's it. That is the test. And what my friend said to me, that sometimes people are determined to believe things about you that have nothing to do with you, is the same test from the other side. If nothing you say makes any difference, you're not in a disagreement, you're in a verdict. Which brings me to something you need to hear, because default blame will fight you on it. If somebody genuinely believes you're capable of the awful thing that they're accusing you of, and they're not willing to have that belief tested, that tells you something about the relationship that has nothing to do with whether or not you did it. Because why would they want you in their life if they thought that of you? Let me flip this for you, because I think you'll accept it faster about someone else than maybe about yourself. Always works pretty well in therapy. Imagine a friend tells you that their partner has accused them of something that they would just never do. They've explained. They've apologized for the misunderstanding, they've gone over it, and the partner won't move. They ask you whether they should try explaining again. What do you tell them? You tell them explaining isn't the problem, and you'd probably be quite angry on their behalf. Now, flip it back and apply that to yourself. Notice how much harder that is. That difficulty is the conditioning, sitting right there where you can feel it. And I want to name an objection here because I know some of you are already probably thinking it, and it's a fair one. Doesn't this just give you permission to dismiss any criticism as control? Can't you use their view can't move to avoid ever hearing anything difficult about yourself? Yeah, you absolutely could. And some people do, which is why it isn't about whether the feedback is uncomfortable. Same test as before. Can they engage with what you say back? Someone who says, that's fair, I hadn't thought about it that way, but I still think the underlying thing stands, is in a conversation with you. Someone who says the same sentence back for the 5th time, regardless of what you said, is not. And honestly, given how ferociously most of you accept criticism about yourselves, the risk of you over-dismissing feedback is not the one that keeps me up at night. And let me tell you, you could apply that idea of whether or not I was just looking for a reason to dismiss the thing that was being said or I was being accused of as control. I wasn't, because I was asking the questions. What is it that makes you think that? What is it that makes you feel that? Please explain to me. And the answer would just be the same back over and over and over again. It never shifted. And then another one came along and the same accusation and the same questions, and it never shifted. So there is a big difference between using it as an excuse to justify dismissing something that you don't want to hear about yourself and it actually being done. If today's episode landed, the place to take it further is the Hub. The Hub is my membership community, and it's where the people who listen to this podcast go when they actually want to do something with it rather than just understand it better. There are courses, live calls, and a community of people who've had roughly the same childhood in different clothing, which means that you can describe the loo roll incident and nobody asks you to explain why that was a big deal. I would love to see you there. It's liberationacademy.co.uk/the-hub. Come and have a look and maybe join in. Take care. Bye. Anyway, moving on. So now, friendships, where a lot of you, I think, maybe have the least language and possibly actually the most damage. Romantic relationships get talked about endlessly. Friendship conflict barely gets talked about at all. And I think that's because there's this kind of unspoken idea that friendship is supposed to be the easy one, the one without all the negotiation. So when it goes wrong, there's absolutely no framework for it and no permission to make a fuss. So what happens instead is you just don't raise it. The friend cancels for the 4th time or says something that stings, or you notice you're always the one making contact and you say nothing. Because a friendship feels like a thing you have no standing to complain about. You're not married to them. There's no contract. They could just leave. And that's the fear underneath it. That friendship is the most easily discarded relationship you have. So raising anything at all risks the whole thing. So instead of conflict, you get slow withdrawal. You reply a bit less. You stop suggesting things. The friendship just stops without either of you ever saying why. And you tell yourself, yeah, we just drifted apart. And that's not you being a bad friend. That's you doing the only thing you were ever shown to do, whether it was at home or socially, which was to disappear rather than say the thing. That may not be your pattern at all. That's fine. Again, it's useful to know. I'd say, though, that that's one of the saddest patterns I do come across, because in a lot of those cases, the friend would have been horrified to know and would have changed the thing or talked about it and found a way through and would still be in their lives. The thing that you're missing potentially is that raising something with a friend is a compliment. You don't do the frightening thing for a relationship that you're indifferent to. Somebody bringing you a grievance is telling you that they want to keep you. And if you can hear it that way round, it changes what the conversation is. And the same test applies as everywhere else. If you raise something small with a friend and their view can move, that friendship has just got sturdier. If it can't, you've learned something you needed to know, and you've learned it over something small rather than finding out in a crisis. Now, the other thing about conflict, which is what happens when both of you have brains like ours. What I see a lot is a couple where the argument isn't the argument at all, it's the recovery mismatch. One of them is done in 20 minutes and genuinely doesn't understand why the other is still upset 3 days later. The other one needs 3 days and experiences the 20-minute recovery as proof that the relationship just doesn't matter to the partner. Both are reading the other's nervous system as a statement about the relationship, and neither of them is doing anything wrong. Same thing with processing speed. One person needs to resolve it now because unresolved conflict is unbearable to them and their whole system is screaming. The other needs 6 hours before they can even locate what they think. And the request for time gets heard as a withdrawal, which, for someone raised on the silent treatment, is the most frightening thing in the world. So they push, which makes the other person need more time, and round it goes. Flip it. Imagine one of your children came home visibly upset and needed 20 minutes in their room before they could tell you what had happened. And imagine standing outside that door, insisting they explain now, because you needed to know now. You wouldn't, I hope. You'd wait, and you'd probably be actually quite proud of them for knowing what they needed, maybe a little envious too. The same courtesy applies to the adults in your life, and this is the harder half, it applies to you as well. While we're on children, there's a version of this that a lot of you are living with right now, which is conflict with your own kids. Because the only template you were given for how a parent handles a child disagreeing with them is the one you have spent your entire adult life either refusing to use or copying, because you didn't know any better. No judgment. So your child pushes back about bedtime or tells you something you said was unfair, and there's genuinely nothing available in your head about what to do next, because the only thing in there is the thing that you've promised yourself you would never do, or, again, the thing that you do, because you don't know any different. So a lot of you just go completely the other way and give in every time, and a lot of you don't. But if you give in, it's because any firmness at all feels like you've become them. I'd say that's understandable, and I'd also say it isn't working. And if that stings, it isn't a criticism of you as a parent. You were given a template and told to build something you'd just never seen. But a child needs to experience disagreement that doesn't destroy anything, because that's how they learn conflict is survivable, and they can only learn that from watching you hold a position kindly and stay in a room. Giving in teaches them your position was never real. Arguing back to silence also does the same thing. It teaches them also, when you're giving in, that pushing hard gets results, which is not the lesson that anyone wants. That is also operant conditioning, them of you. You can say no, explain it, hear their objection properly, and still say no. That's conflict done well, and it will feel to you like you are being cruel. You may project onto them your feelings from childhood, but you're not being. Which brings me to the relationship advice you may well have been given, most of which was not built for brains like ours. Never go to bed angry is a terrible rule for someone who needs processing time. All it guarantees is a conversation conducted by two exhausted people at midnight, which is not a conversation. It's an endurance event. Use I statements assumes you can identify what you need what you feel or even need in real time, which, if you listen to episode 1, you'll know is not a given for a lot of us. And repair in the moment assumes both people regulate at the same rate, which is exactly what we've just established is often not true. None of that advice is malicious, just want to be very clear, just wasn't written with autistic or ADHD brains in mind. And when it doesn't work, you've quite reasonably concluded that you're the broken thing. So what do you actually do? The first thing, and it has to happen when you're calm, is deciding in advance what distinguishes a disagreement from danger for you, because you cannot assess that live. Your system has already responded before any assessment could happen. For most people, it comes down to something like, are they talking about the thing or about me? Can their view move? And is this going to come back at me later? Write your version down. Somewhere you'll actually find it, which for those of us with ADHD is a genuine design problem and not a joke. And the failure mode on this one, so you're expecting it, you'll write the list, and then in the moment, you won't remember a single word of it. It's not the list failing. Even having written it changes what you notice afterwards. And afterwards is where you'll do most of your early work, because live is just too fast for now. Then once you've got that even loosely in place, the prepared line, you are going to freeze. That's not a prediction I'm making about you personally. It's the baseline for this audience. If you freeze in the moment, you have not failed. You've done the thing that your brain was trained to do under threat, which is why you prepare lines when you're not in it. I need to think about that, and I'll come back to you. I don't agree, but I want to understand why you see it that way. That's not going to work for me. That is the whole line. That last one is a complete sentence and does not require a justification afterwards, though you will want to add it one, and it will take you a very long time before you stop. The failure mode here is that it will feel like lying. It might even feel like manipulation or control. You'll say the prepared line and your whole body will tell you that you're being fake, manipulative, performing something that isn't you. That's not a signal that you're doing it wrong. That's just what saying something unfamiliar feels like when the familiar thing was silence. Then there's the pause. And this is the one I'd want you to take away if you take nothing else. If you need time, take it. But say when you're coming back and then come back. I need an hour and then I want to finish this. Is a completely different act from walking out of the room, because an open-ended withdrawal is the silent treatment, whether you mean it that way or not. And for someone raised the way that you were, being on the receiving end of that is terrifying, adult or child. Your need for processing time is 100% legitimate. Attaching a return time to it is what makes it a boundary rather than a punishment. And if you're the one waiting, the hour is not rejection. Be firm with yourself about that, because your brain will spend that hour building a case that it is. The failure mode on this one is ADHD specific, and it's a big one. You'll say an hour and then genuinely lose the hour. And I'm laughing a little bit because same. And I genuinely apologize to every single person that I have ever said I will be an hour and lost that time, because I didn't have this technique. Set an alarm. And it sounds absurd for something emotional. Well, it is a bit absurd to somebody who doesn't have a brain like ours, but it also protects the other person, the person you care about, the person you love and want the relationship to succeed with, from experiencing your time blindness as abandonment. Now, the repair. Because the thing you said in the heat of the moment is not the catastrophe you think it is. Say it landed badly. That came out harsher than I meant. I'm sorry. What I was trying to say was this. That's repair. And it takes about 10 seconds. It isn't a confession that you're fundamentally the problem, and it doesn't reopen the whole thing. Default blame will try to turn one sharp sentence into proof of everything you already think about yourself. Notice it doing that. You're allowed to have said something badly and still be right about the underlying point. Two things can be true at once. The other little twisteroo in this situation is that in the past, conceding any kind of agreement or fault to their points might have meant annihilation when the toxic parent or whomever it was latched onto it and used it against you. So you become defensive and defended, and when you realise there might be a awkward point to their argument, you panic a bit because you're terrified they will do the same. But if they do, that's data about them and the relationship. Accountability shouldn't be met with a, ha, I knew it, you really are evil. It should be accepted with thanks, and that's really helpful. Just grace. Conflict for growth, not for points. For those of you where communication mismatch is the recurring issue, the useful move is agreeing it out loud with the people who matter outside of any argument. Something like, I take things really literally sometimes, and I might miss that you were joking, so I'm going to ask rather than assume. Or, my tone doesn't always match what I mean, so if I sound sharp, please check with me. And I will also maybe correct myself too, And then the actual work, which is asking what someone meant rather than deciding, because deciding is faster and feels safer and is wrong more often than you'd think. There's one more, which is the one you'll skip. Raise one tiny thing with somebody safe. Not the big thing, the small thing you'd normally absorb, the wrong order in the coffee shop, the friend who was 20 minutes late, and say it once, plainly. The failure mode here is that this feels too small to matter, and you'll conclude it just doesn't count. It counts more than anything else, because you cannot practice conflict on the terrifying stuff, and every small thing that you say and survive is data that your brain didn't have yesterday. Now, what progress actually looks like, because I really want you to just have a very realistic measure. Progress is not calm conflict. You may never have calm conflict, and I'd say I haven't really got there myself. For all my training and therapy and knowing exactly how all this works, I say it every episode, it still catches me out, especially when I'm tired or in pain or my cognitive load is already high. Progress is shorter recovery. 3 days becomes a day becomes an evening becomes a couple of hours and a slightly rough night's sleep. Progress is noticing the flood while it's happening rather than a week later. Progress is saying the thing badly rather than not saying it at all. And the response coming back sometimes under fatigue or stress or when someone reminds you of them doesn't mean you've undone your progress. Conditioned responses get overwritten. They don't get deleted. So the old one resurfacing is information about your load that day, not a verdict on the work. One last thing. None of this works with someone who escalates. If you're in a relationship or a situation where raising something safely isn't available to you, where the cost of speaking is genuinely high, then the timing of that is yours to judge, and nobody, including me, is in a position to tell you when. Okay, this is the bit that you might not enjoy. Understanding why you avoid conflict is the start of the work. It's not the work. And I think some of you have got very good at the explanation. You can say, I'm conflict avoidant because of my childhood, with real fluency. And it's true. And it's also become the thing that you say instead of the difficult thing that you need to say. The explanation was supposed to be a starting point. It's turned into somewhere to sort of just sit down and stop. I'm not blaming you for that, because the explanation genuinely does bring relief, and the relief is reinforcing. So of course you go back to it. And you were taught over years that speaking up carries a cost that you cannot pay. That's conditioning, not cowardice. And I am not confusing the two. But here's what you owe yourself, and it isn't conflict done well. You owe yourself the sentence, said badly, slightly the wrong moment, in a voice that maybe shakes, possibly followed by a shame spiral that you'll have to talk yourself down from over the next 2 days. Not conflict done well. Conflict done at all. Because every year you spend not saying it is another year of evidence for your brain that saying it would have been unsurvivable. And you can't build the counter-evidence without doing the thing. Next week is the last episode of the season, and we're talking about a work in progress. What realistic change actually looks like when you've got a brain like ours and a childhood like ours. So I want to know, what does progress look like for you specifically? Not the big version, the small measurable one that you'd actually notice. So there we are. Thank you as ever for listening, and all that remains to be said is take care.